For over a century, we've told our children that Alice in Wonderland is a story about a dream. We lied. To the casual reader, it's a whimsical trip down the rabbit hole, a world of talking cats, unbirthday parties, and nonsensical riddles. But the historical record reveals that this wasn't a fairy tale. It was a crime scene concealed in ink. And once you understand the cold reality behind Lewis Carroll's masterpiece, you will never look at this children's classic the same way again. The true story doesn't begin on a golden afternoon in 1862. It begins in a dimly lit study in 1898, just days after Carroll died. Imagine the scene. His family gathers around his heavy oak desk, the air thick with the smell of stale pipe tobacco. They unlock his private diary and turn to the pages dated June 1863, the specific period when the author was intimately close to the real-life 10-year-old Alice Liddell. They read the entry. The room goes silent, and then someone picks up a blade. With surgical precision, 4 entire pages are cut from the binding and tossed into the fireplace. The secrets of his relationship with Alice turn to ash and smoke, lost to history forever. But while his family managed to burn the diary, they forgot about the manuscript itself. Because Alice in Wonderland isn't just a fantasy. It is a cultural bomb disguised as nonsense, a brutal, coded exposé of a society poisoning its children, destroying its workers, and rotting from the inside out. If the burnt diary represents the private secrets Lewis Carroll was desperate to hide, the published manuscript reveals the public horrors he was desperate to expose. And to find the first body buried in the text, we don't have to look very far. We just have to look at the one chapter he specifically wrote for the rest of us. You have to remember, the original version of this story, Alice's Adventures Underground, was a handwritten Christmas gift for Alice Liddell. It was sweet, intimate, and full of inside jokes. But when Carroll decided to publish it for the world in 1865, he didn't just polish the grammar. He violently expanded the narrative. He inserted scenes of such grotesque physical horror that they would seem out of place in a modern horror film, let alone a nursery rhyme. The most disturbing of these additions is the chapter of the Duchess and the Pig Baby. Alice enters a house filled with pepper and violence. A cook is hurling pots and pans. A duchess is roughly handling a howling infant, tossing it into the air with a reckless disregard for its life. Alice, fearing for the child's safety, rescues it. She carries the baby out into the woods, holding it tenderly. But then, the child begins to change. Carroll writes, "The baby grunted, and Alice looked very anxiously into its face to see what was the matter. Its eyes were getting extremely small for a baby. Altogether, Alice did not like the look of the thing at all. The transformation accelerates. The nose turns up. The skin shifts. The crying turns to grunting. In Alice's arms, the human child physically devolves into a pig. She sets it down, and it trots away into the forest." For decades, literary critics have dismissed this as pure, drug-induced whimsy. In the 1960 seconds, counterculture icons claimed Alice was a manifesto for psychedelics, that the mushroom-eating caterpillar and the transforming baby were the hallucinations of an author experimenting with mind-altering substances. They were half right. The story is about drugs, but it wasn't inspired by the recreational psychedelics of the Woodstock generation. It was a mirror held up to the crushing, chemical reality of the Victorian working class. The madness of the pig baby wasn't a hallucination. It was a clinical diagnosis. To understand the horror Carroll was encoding, you have to understand the smell of a Victorian nursery. It didn't smell like baby powder. It smelled like thick, cloying treacle and alcohol. In the mid-19th century, opium wasn't an illicit substance found in back-alley dens. It was the aspirin of its day. It was legal, it was untaxed, and it was everywhere. You could buy it at the grocer alongside your tea. You could buy it at the pub. You could buy it at the stationer's. And because there was almost no regulation, it was cheaper than gin and more readily available than clean water. But the Victorians didn't just take opium themselves. They fed it to their children. This was the era of the Industrial Revolution. The social fabric of England was being torn apart by the demands of the factory whistle. For the first time in history, mothers were forced out of the home and into the textile mills and coal mines, working brutal 14-hour shifts just to keep their families from starvation. There was no maternity leave. There was no daycare. So, how do you keep a hungry, neglected infant quiet while you work the loom? Or, if you're a poor woman paying a baby farmer a few pennies to watch your child, how does she manage 10 crying infants in a single room? You drug them, marketed under innocent, comforting names like Mrs. Winslow's, soothing syrup, Street's infant quietness, and the most infamous of all, Godfrey's cordial. These mixtures were nothing more than heavy syrups loaded with laudanum, liquid opium. The bottle labels featured idyllic drawings of cherubic, sleeping babies, promising mothers a restful night. But the reality inside the bottle was a chemical weapon. In 1854, a decade before Alice was published, a woman named Sarah Whitfield stood before a London coroner's inquest. Her story was not unique. It was statistically mundane, which is what makes it so terrifying. Sarah was a textile worker, exhausted, overworked, and desperate. Her 6-month-old son had been fussy, likely from hunger or teething, and she needed to sleep before her next shift. She admitted to the court that she gave him a teaspoon of Godfrey's cordial. She told the coroner she had done it many times before. It was mother's friend, after all. The baby fell silent almost immediately. The crying stopped. The house was peaceful. But when Sarah woke up before dawn to head to the factory, the silence was too heavy. She went to the crib. Her son's lips were a distinct, bruise-like blue. His tiny limbs were cold. The coroner recorded the death as accidental poisoning by laudanum. Historical records from the time suggest that in some industrial districts, 5 out of 6 working-class families were regularly dosing their children with opiates. In Manchester, one druggist reported selling 5 gallons of Godfrey's cordial a week, enough to knock out an army, distributed solely to infants. This is where Lewis Carroll, the observer, comes in. He wasn't just a mathematician. He was a photographer, and a man deeply obsessed with the physiology of children. He noticed things others ignored. Contemporary medical reports from the 1,860 seconds describe the physical side effects of chronic opium poisoning in infants. It wasn't just that they died. It was how they looked while they were dying. Doctors noted that these narcotic infants didn't grow. They wasted away. Their skin became loose and wrinkled, hanging off their tiny bones. Their eyes, pinned by the opiates, looked sunken and small. Their noses, due to the skeletal wasting, appeared prominent and snout-like. One medical officer wrote that these poisoned children shrank up into little old men, or withered creatures, effectively losing their humanity before they even had a chance to grow into it. Now, reread the passage in Alice. Carroll doesn't just say the baby turned into a pig. He describes the process. He describes the nose turning up into a snout. He describes the eyes becoming extremely small. He describes the creature becoming less human and more bestial. The pig baby wasn't nonsense. It was a caricature of a Godfrey's baby. When Alice holds that child, she is holding a victim of the Victorian era's casual relationship with poison. The Duchess, who flings the baby around and ignores its cries, represents the systemic neglect of a society that prioritized industrial output over human life. The transformation isn't magic. It's a time-lapse of malnutrition and narcotic decay. Carroll was forcing his readers, the comfortable, upper-class families who bought his book, to look at something they tried desperately to ignore. He was taking the cherubic image from the soothing syrup advertisements and replacing it with the grotesque reality, a generation of children turning into livestock, quieted by the treacle that Alice hears about later in the Mad Hatter's riddle. And the horror doesn't stop in the nursery, because the same chemical madness that was withering the children was also dissolving the minds of the men who made their clothes. Alice puts down the pig and walks deeper into the woods, straight toward a tea party that has been running for eternity. She is about to meet a man whose very profession has eaten holes in his brain. The baby was a victim of the home. The Hatter is a casualty of the factory. Alice leaves the Duchess' house, shaking the memory of the pig baby from her mind, and wanders into a clearing. There, set out under a tree, is a long table. We have arrived at the most iconic scene in the book, the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. To the modern eye, this scene is the pinnacle of whimsy. It's the image plastered on lunchboxes, Disney rides, and birthday cards. We see a quirky, eccentric character in a top hat, trading nonsensical riddles with a hare and a sleepy dormouse. We laugh at his rudeness. We smile at his erratic behavior. But if you were a Victorian reader in 1865, you wouldn't be smiling. You would be squirming in your seat, because you would know exactly what you were looking at. You see, Lewis Carroll didn't invent the phrase mad as a hatter. It was a common, cruel slang term used on the streets of London, as recognizable then as a slur might be today. It wasn't a description of a personality type. It was a description of an occupational disease that was actively liquidating the brains of thousands of British workers. When Alice sits down at that table, she isn't joining a party. She is walking into a quarantine zone for the terminally ill. To understand the Hatter, we have to look at the hat on his head. In the 1800s, the top hat was the ultimate symbol of the gentleman. It represented status, wealth, and respectability. But to create that smooth, stiff felt texture from raw rabbit fur, the hat-making industry relied on a chemical process called carroting. The process involved washing the animal pelts in a solution of mercury nitrate. It was called carroting because the chemical turned the fur a vibrant, toxic orange before it was dyed black. In the damp, unventilated workshops of Stockport and London places known as shops hatters would spend 12 hours a day bent over steaming vats of this solution. They didn't use gloves. They didn't have masks. With every breath, they inhaled mercury vapor. With every hat they shaped, the liquid metal seeped into their pores. Mercury is a neurotoxin. It doesn't kill you quickly. It dismantles you piece by piece. It bypasses the blood-brain barrier and begins to rot the nervous system from the inside out. The first sign of the poisoning was physical. It started with a slight trembling in the hands. The workers called it the Hatter's Shakes. Imagine the scene at the tea table again. Watch the Hatter. He is constantly drinking tea, fiddling with the cups, moving things around. In the text, he is described as biting a piece out of his teacup in his nervousness. This isn't just silly animation. This is a man whose motor control is completely shot. The Hatter's Shakes eventually became so severe that workers couldn't button their own shirts or feed themselves. They would spill their drinks simply trying to lift them to their mouths. Is it any wonder the Hatter is obsessed with tea? He's likely trying to steady his hands, or perhaps wash away the constant, metallic taste that mercury leaves in the mouth, a symptom documented in almost every medical report of the era. But the physical degradation was nothing compared to what the mercury did to the mind. The clinical name for mercury poisoning is erethism. Its symptoms read like a character profile of Carroll's Hatter exactly. Extreme social phobia, irritability, erratic mood swings, and pathological timidity mixed with sudden outbursts of aggression. Victorian doctors noted that poisoned hatters would become terrified if a stranger entered the room. They would speak in confused, rapid bursts. They would hallucinate. Now, look at how the Hatter treats Alice. One moment he is aggressively rude, challenging her with unanswerable riddles. Why is a raven like a writing desk? The next moment, he is terrified, trembling because the Queen might cut off his head. He is emotionally volatile, paranoid, and nonsensical. This isn't magical madness. This is erethism. Carroll, the observer, was transcribing the specific psychological breakdown of a mercury-poisoned worker. Even the Hatter's obsession with time is a coded reference to the labourer's plight. In the story, the Hatter tells Alice that he quarrelled with time last March, and now time won't do anything he asks. "It's always 6 o'clock now," he says. For a modern reader, this is a fun play on words. For a Victorian factory worker, this was a nightmare. Factory life was governed by the clock. The difference between 5:59 and 6 was the difference between pay and poverty. But for the piecework hatters, their lives were trapped in an eternal loop of production. By freezing the party at 6 p.m. tea time, Carroll traps the Hatter in the one moment of the day he might have had a break. Yet he is unable to enjoy it because he is stuck in a loop of manic, repetitive behavior. He is moving seats, pouring tea, asking riddles, but getting nowhere. It's a hellish purgatory of industrial repetition. But here is the darkest part of the industrial madness. This wasn't a secret. The medical community knew mercury was killing hatters as early as 1829. By 1860, the year before Carroll began writing Alice, the French Academy of Medicine had already confirmed the link and urged a ban on mercury nitrate. But in England, the industry kept going. The hat manufacturers knew their workers were going mad. The government knew. The public who bought the hats knew, hence the phrase, mad as a hatter. But the demand for cheap, stylish hats for the wealthy was considered more important than the sanity of the men who made them. The use of mercury in hat making wasn't banned in the UK until the 20th century. For nearly 100 years, men like the character Carroll immortalized were knowingly sacrificed on the altar of fashion. When you watch The Hatter today, you are watching a tragedy masquerading as a comedy. The funny character is a man in the final stages of heavy metal poisoning. His friends, the March Hare and the Dormouse, are his fellow outcasts. Note that the March Hare is mad too, another idiom, mad as a March Hare. And the Dormouse can't stay awake, narcolepsy and lethargy, being the final stages of comatose organ failure. They are a cluster of broken things, discarded by a society that used them up and threw them into the woods. Carroll forces Alice and the reader to sit at that table. He forces us to endure the discomfort of the Hatter's madness. Alice eventually leaves, declaring, "It's the stupidest tea party I ever was at in all my life." She has the luxury of leaving. She can walk away from the madness of the industrial machine. The Hatter cannot. He is stuck there forever, trembling, waiting for a time that will never move forward, imprisoned by the very object on his head that gave him his name. But as Alice leaves the tragedy of the working class behind, she walks straight into the arms of the system that created it. She is heading for the croquet ground. She is about to meet the government. And if you thought the Hatter was mad, wait until you meet the woman who holds the axe. Alice leaves the smell of mercury and madness behind her. She walks away from the tea party, desperate for structure, desperate for rules, desperate for something that makes sense. She pushes through a small door in a tree and finally enters the beautiful garden she has been trying to reach since the beginning of the story. But she doesn't find peace. She finds panic. She encounters 3 gardeners, flat, living playing cards, who are frantically painting a bush of white roses red. Their hands are trembling. They are terrified. When Alice asks why they are doing this, they whisper the answer. "If the Queen finds out, she'll have our heads cut off." On the surface, this is just another layer of Wonderland's absurdity. Who cares what colour a flower is? Why would a ruler execute her servants over a gardening mistake? It seems like a childish exaggeration of a bad temper. But Lewis Carroll wasn't writing for children here. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. The scene in Alice, where the gardeners are painting the roses, is a coded reenactment of the desperate political flipping that defined that era. In the 1400s, displaying the wrong flower on your doublet didn't just mean you were out of fashion, it meant you were a traitor. Men were dragged from their homes and beheaded simply because the colour of the throne had changed overnight. Carroll is referencing the terrifying reality of living under an unstable regime. The gardeners aren't just painting flowers. They are frantically trying to change their political allegiance before the authority figure arrives to kill them. It's a metaphor for the survival instinct of the common man, caught between warring tyrants. Paint the rose red. Pretend you were loyal all along. Do it fast, or die. And then, the tyrant arrives. Enter the Queen of Hearts. If the Mad Hatter represents the suffering of the worker, the Queen of Hearts represents the absolute, arbitrary terror of the state. She is often played as a villain, but she is actually something much scarier. She is a caricature of absolute monarchy. Her catchphrase, "Off with their heads," is shrieked at the slightest provocation. A missed turn in a game? Execution? A stolen tart? Execution. A lack of enthusiasm? Execution. Carroll's readers would have recognized this too. They knew the history of the Battle of Towton in 1461. It is often cited as the bloodiest day in English history. Amidst a blinding snowstorm, 50,000 men from the red and white factions clashed. The fighting was so savage that the snow turned crimson. The nearby river, the Cockbeck, was said to have run with blood for days. When the Yorkist forces, the White Rose, won, they didn't take prisoners. They executed 42 knights from the Red Rose faction on the spot. This is the historical DNA of the Queen of Hearts. When she screams for heads to roll, she isn't being whimsical. She is channeling the very real ghosts of English monarchs who treated their subjects' lives as disposable pawns. Carroll even encodes this violence into the game the Queen plays. They play croquet, but the mallets are live flamingos and the balls are live hedgehogs. Think about the mechanics of that. The equipment is alive, it struggles, it feels pain. The hedgehog tries to run away. The flamingo twists its neck to look at Alice. But the Queen forces them to be inanimate objects, to be used for her amusement. This is a blistering critique of how the Victorian aristocracy viewed the lower classes. To the Queen, the hedgehogs and flamingos aren't living beings with their own agency. They are tools to help her win a game. Just as the factory owners viewed the hatters not as men, but as mechanisms to produce felt, the Queen views her subjects not as people, but as equipment. And notice the fairness of the game. It doesn't exist. The Queen never loses, not because she is skilled, but because the system is rigged to ensure she wins. The soldiers, who are the archers, get up and move themselves to accommodate her shots. They flatten themselves to the ground to ensure her ball passes through. Carroll is exposing the divine right of kings for what it really was, a rigged game. The rules of society, the laws of the land, were not static. They bent and shifted to serve the person in power. If you were a commoner, a hedgehog, you were kicked around. If you were a soldier, you bent your back to let the Queen pass. And if you were a gardener, you painted the truth a different color just to keep your head attached to your neck. The scariest moment in this section comes when Alice finally confronts the Queen. The King of Hearts, trying to be the good cop, suggests that maybe they shouldn't execute everyone. The Queen silences him instantly. There is no trial. There is no jury. There is only the verdict. This mirrors the infamous Star Chamber courts of English history, or the summary executions of the Tudor period. Carroll was a man of logic, a mathematician. To him, the Queen of Hearts was the ultimate nightmare because she represented the absence of logic. She was pure, chaotic emotion holding a weapon. In a society that prided itself on order and civilization, the buzzwords of Victorian England, Carroll was showing the dark truth. The entire system was based on the whim of the person at the top. The peace of the garden was a lie, maintained by fear and fresh paint. By the time Alice leaves the croquet ground, she has learned a terrifying lesson. The madness of Wonderland isn't just in the chemical poisoning of the Hatter or the drug abuse of the Duchess. The madness goes all the way to the top. The government itself is insane. But if the laws of the land are broken, what about the laws of the mind? Alice has survived the factory and the court. Now, she has to face the institution that was supposed to prepare her for all of this. She has to face the classroom, because the only thing more dangerous than a queen who cuts off heads is an education system that cuts off the ability to think. If the factory destroyed the body and the Queen destroyed the sense of safety, the Victorian classroom was designed to destroy the imagination. Before Alice fell down the rabbit hole, she was a product of a very specific machine. She was a good Victorian child. Her head was packed with multiplication tables, French grammar, geography facts, and moral poems. She had been trained, like a circus animal, to repeat information on command. But watch what happens when she tries to use that training in Wonderland. In a moment of panic, trying to ground herself in reality, Alice attempts to recite her lessons. She starts with math. Let me see. 4 times 5 is 12, and 4 times 6 is 13. She stops. She knows it's wrong. She tries geography. London is the capital of Paris, and Paris is the capital of Rome. She fails again. Finally, she tries to recite a standard moral poem, How Doth the Little Busy Bee, a verse every Victorian child was forced to memorize to teach them the value of hard work and industry. But the words that come out of her mouth aren't about industrious bees making honey. They are about a predator. Hello. I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you. And let's begin our creative audio journey together. If you calculate the sums using different number bases, base 18, base 21, her equations actually work. 4 times 5 is 12 inches, base 18. Carroll was demonstrating that truth changes depending on the system you are using. In the real world, Alice's knowledge is solid. In Wonderland, the base has shifted, and her memorized facts are useless. She suffers a complete identity crisis. Who in the world am I? Because her entire sense of self was built on repeating things she didn't actually understand. The moment the context changed, her education collapsed. And notice the poem. She tries to recite a poem about working hard, the bee, but her subconscious forces her to recite a poem about eating the weak, the crocodile. Carroll is subtly revealing the truth about the society Alice lives in. It isn't a hive of busy, happy workers. It is a river where the smiling predators, the factory owners, the aristocrats, swallow the little fishes whole. And nowhere is this predatory nature more obvious than in the final institution Alice faces, the law. The climax of the book is the trial of the Knave of Hearts. The charge? Stealing some tarts. If you want to see the most biting satire in English literature, look at this courtroom. The jury is made up of stupid animals who write down their names so they don't forget them. The judge is the king, who is too terrified of his wife to make a ruling. Evidence is completely fabricated. At one point, a piece of paper is produced with a poem on it. There is no name signed to it. The handwriting doesn't match the prisoner's. That proves his guilt, says the Queen. He must have meant to do some mischief, or else Head have signed his name like an honest man. It is funny because it is absurd. It is terrifying because it is real. This wasn't fantasy. It was a documentary. In 1856, a case shook London that could have been ripped straight from the pages of this chapter. A seamstress named Mary Barrett, living in the slums of Whitechapel, was brought before a magistrate. Her crime? She had stolen a loaf of bread worth 3 pennies. Mary had 3 children at home. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She wasn't a criminal. She was starving. The court didn't care about the context. The law was the law. The evidence, the missing bread, was irrefutable. Mary Barrett was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor in Newgate Prison. Records show she died of typhus within 3 weeks of her incarceration. She was executed, essentially, for a loaf of bread. Now, compare that to the gentlemen of the era. In the same year, the Honourable Augustus Fitzhugh, the son of an earl, appeared before the same court system. He had assaulted a housemaid, beating her so severely she was bedridden for a month. Multiple witnesses testified to his violence. The verdict? He was fined £1. That was less than the cost of a bottle of champagne at his club. He paid it on the spot and left, with the judge warning him to conduct himself as befits a gentleman. This is the justice Lewis Carroll saw every day, a system where a hungry woman dies for bread and a rich man pays pocket change for assault. When the Queen of Hearts screams sentence first, verdict afterwards, she isn't inventing a new legal concept. She is summarizing the Victorian approach to the poor. If you were poor, you were guilty. The trial was just a formality to determine how much you would suffer. The Knave of Hearts is on trial for stealing tarts pastries. It's a direct parallel to the petty theft of food that filled Victorian prisons. The fury with which the Queen attacks him mirrors the disproportionate rage the British Empire directed at its own starving population. This is the breaking point for Alice. Throughout the book, she has tried to be polite. She has curtsied. She has recited her lessons. She has tried to follow the rules. But in this courtroom, watching the king read nonsense from a notebook and the Queen demand an execution without evidence, the veil finally drops. She realizes that the adults in charge aren't wise. They aren't noble. They are incompetent bullies bullying a scarecrow. Stuff and nonsense, said Alice loudly. The idea of having the sentence first. Hold your tongue, said the Queen, turning purple. I won't, said Alice. Off with her head, the Queen shouted at the top of her voice. And then Alice delivers the line that shatters the entire illusion, the line that exposes the emptiness of the entire Victorian power structure. Who cares for you? Said Alice. She had grown to her full size by this time. You're nothing but a pack of cards. She doesn't say, you are monsters. She says, you are cards. You are flimsy. You are two-dimensional. You have no weight. You only have power because we pretend you do. In that moment, the terrifying Queen, the executioner, the soldiers, they all rise up into the air and flutter down onto her face like dead leaves. The nightmare ends not because Alice escaped, but because she refused to believe in their authority anymore. Carroll wasn't just writing a brave ending for a storybook character. He was planting a seed of rebellion in the mind of every child who read his book. He was whispering a dangerous secret: authority is only real if you agree to play the game. If you stand up, if you grow to your full size, you will see that the tyrants are made of paper. But as Alice wakes up on the riverbank, brushing the dead leaves from her face, we are left with one final, uncomfortable question. Alice woke up, but did we? Alice opens her eyes. She is back on the riverbank. The sun is shining. The frantic courtroom, the screaming Queen, and the dying Hatter have all vanished. Her sister tells her it was just a curious dream, born of the summer heat. That is the happy ending we tell our children. Alice escaped the madness. She returned to sanity. But if you've followed the breadcrumbs we've laid out today, you know that is the darkest lie of all. Alice didn't wake up from a nightmare. She woke up into one. She woke up to a reality where the Mad Hatter was still trembling in a factory in Stockport, his brain slowly rotting from mercury poisoning. She woke up to a world where the pig baby was still lying in a crib in Manchester, turning blue from a dose of Godfrey's cordial. She woke up to a country ruled by a queen whose empire was built on the blood of the poor and whose courts sent starving women to their deaths for the crime of being hungry. Wonderland wasn't a fantasy world. It was a funhouse mirror reflection of Victorian England, distorted, yes, but horrifyingly accurate. And this is the true genius of Lewis Carroll. He was a man who lived in a society of suffocating rules and polite silence. He saw the industrial slaughter, the chemical addiction, and the political tyranny. And he knew he couldn't speak about it openly. If he had written an essay attacking the factory owners or the monarchy, he would have been censored, ruined, or ignored. So, he did something brilliant. He camouflaged his rage as nonsense. He hid a revolutionary manifesto inside a nursery rhyme. He built a Trojan horse out of talking animals and playing cards. And he smuggled the darkest secrets of his era into the one place no censor would ever look, the bedrooms of children. Which brings us back to that fireplace in 1898. When Carroll died, his family frantically burned those pages from his diary. They wanted to protect his reputation. They wanted to hide the nature of his relationship with the real Alice Liddell. They thought that by destroying the paper, they could destroy the scandal. But they missed the point. The most shocking secrets Lewis Carroll ever held weren't written in the diary they burned. They were printed in the book they kept. They burned the man's private life, but the indictment of his world survived. It sits on our bookshelves today, disguised in Disney colors, waiting for someone to look past the grin of the Cheshire Cat and see the teeth. If you enjoyed peeling back the layers of this childhood classic, you should know that almost every fairy tale you know hides a history just as dark as this one. We are going to expose them all, one by one. So, if you want to see the history they left out of the textbooks, click that subscribe button and ring the bell. Join us down the rabbit hole. There is so much more to find in the dark. In the end, Alice in Wonderland endures not because it is nonsense, but because it is the only honest book of its time. It asks us the question that haunts us to this day. In a world built on exploitation, greed, and arbitrary cruelty, who are the ones who are truly mad? The girl talking to a cat, or the society that drove her to it?